The notary's pen was already in my hand when the young woman behind the desk looked at me, really looked at me, and said something that changed everything. She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. She just leaned slightly forward, her voice barely above a whisper, and said, "Ma'am, before you sign, can I get you a glass of water? The washroom is just down the hall. Take your time." My son-in-law shifted in his seat beside me. "Mum, we're fine. We don't need. I'd love some water, actually," I said. I don't know why I said it. I wasn't thirsty. But something in the way she looked at me, not at the papers, not at him, made me want to stay in that moment a little longer. That was a Tuesday morning in February. Outside, downtown Ottawa was the colour of old dishwater, the kind of grey that settles in after Christmas and doesn't leave until April. I'd worn my good coat, the navy wool one I keep for appointments. My daughter had told me to dress nicely. "It's just paperwork, Mum, that the office is professional." I should have asked more questions then. I know that now. My name is Vivienne. I'm 68 years old, retired from 31 years teaching high school English in Canada, and I like to think I'm a reasonably sharp woman. I read, I vote, I balanced my own finances for decades while raising 2 children, mostly on my own after Gerald passed. I am not the kind of woman who gets taken advantage of. That's what I would have told you in January. I'm not sure what I'd tell you now. My daughter Celia is 41. She married a man named Bryce 11 years ago, and I have genuinely tried to like him. He's not cruel. He's not loud. He's the kind of man who is always slightly too interested in your finances and not quite interested enough in you. He asks how you're doing the way someone reads a form. He listens just long enough to redirect the conversation back to money, property, plans. When Celia first brought him home, Gerald was still alive, and Gerald said to me quietly in the kitchen, "That one counts things." I didn't know what he meant then. I do now. After Gerald died, 8 years ago, heart attack, very sudden, we had no warning, I found myself alone in the house we'd owned for 26 years. A 4-bedroom in Beer Haven, nothing fancy, but paid off and ours. Gerald had a small pension from the federal government and a life insurance policy. Nothing that would make the news, but enough that I didn't have to worry. Celia started coming around more after her father died, which I appreciated. Bryce came too sometimes. He would notice things out loud. The roof was aging, the furnace was old, the neighbourhood was changing. "You've got a lot tied up in this house, Vivienne," he'd say. He never called me Mum. "Have you thought about what you want to do with it long term?" I told him I hadn't. I told him I was still grieving. He nodded, like that was a data point. The conversation shifted gradually, the way a river changes course. So slowly, you don't notice until you're somewhere completely different. By last autumn, it had become regular. What did I plan to do with the house? Had I updated my will? Had I thought about power of attorney? Wasn't I lonely rattling around in all that space? Celia echoed him, but softer, framing it as concern. "We just want to make sure you're protected, Mum. We want to make sure things are in order." I let a lawyer friend of Bryce's draw up a power of attorney. That was November. It seemed reasonable at the time. I was 68, Gerald was gone, Celia was my closest family. My son, my younger one, his name is Theo, he lives in Vancouver, had visited in the summer, and I hadn't mentioned any of it to him. I didn't want to seem like I was making a fuss. In December, Bryce mentioned that the housing market in Barhaven was strong right now, that if I was going to make a move, it would be smart to do it before spring. He had a friend in real estate. He had a friend in real estate. He had a friend in property management. He'd been looking at retirement communities, not nursing homes, he was careful to say. Retirement communities, very different. And there was a lovely one in Nepean, very modern. Had a waiting list. We'd pay the fees from the estate management account. You'd never have to think about it. I said I didn't want to think about it yet. He said that was fine. That was December. In January, Celia cried on the phone and told me she was worried about me being alone in that house all winter. What if I fell? What if the pipes froze and I couldn't manage? Didn't I want to be somewhere with people, with activities, with support? She'd visited the Nepean place and it was beautiful, she said. They had a library. I said the house had a library. It was called my living room. She laughed, but she sounded tired. By the time February came, and Bryce said there was just some paperwork to sign. A formality, he said, an authorization for the estate management account, so that things would be streamlined. I had been so slowly, so patiently prepared that I almost didn't notice what was actually being asked. The notary's office was on Sparks Street, 3rd floor. The elevator smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. Celia had said she'd meet us there but texted at the last minute. Running late, just go ahead. She'd be there in 20 minutes. I noticed I was alone with Bryce in the elevator. I noticed, but I filed it away. The woman at the front desk was young, maybe late 20s, South Asian, with her hair pulled back and a quiet kind of attention about her. Her name tag said Priya. She checked us in, made copies of my ID, offered us seats. Bryce had brought the documents in a folder. He handed them across the desk and said, "Everything should be in order. We spoke with your colleague last week." Priya looked at the papers. She looked at them longer than you look at something you've already seen. Then she looked at me. That was when she asked if I wanted water. Bryce said we didn't need it. I said I'd love some. He made a sound in his throat, very small, the way you do when you're keeping something in. And something about that sound, I had heard it before, I realized. In December, when I said I didn't want to think about it. In January, when I made the library joke, it was the sound of a patient man reaching the limit of his patience. I stood up and said I'd just used the washroom. "The documents," he started. "We'll still be there in 5 minutes," I said, and I walked down the hall. The washroom was single occupancy. I stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists, something I used to do when I was anxious before parent-teacher nights. And I looked at myself in the mirror and tried to think clearly. What was I signing? Bryce had explained it. An authorization for the estate management account, streamlining the process. A formality. But Gerald's voice was in my head. That one counts things. And I stood there under the fluorescent light and thought, I have never seen the estate management account statements. I have signed papers authorizing it, but I have never received a single statement. I asked once in December, and Bryce said they were consolidated with his firm for tax purposes, and he forwarded them. He hadn't. I thought about the house. My house. 26 years. I thought about how Celia was late, how she was always present for the conversations, but had sent me ahead alone for the signing. I dried my hands. When I came back out into the hallway, Priya was standing near the water cooler, not at her desk, which was around the corner. She handed me a paper cup and glanced toward the office where Bryce was waiting. "Miss Vivienne," she said quietly. She'd read my name off the ID. Is this something you want to do today?" I looked at her. "I'm not trying to interfere," she said, quickly, professionally. We see a lot of paperwork here, and sometimes people feel like they have to move faster than they're comfortable with." She paused. "You don't have to sign anything today," I said. "What exactly is in those documents?" She hesitated. "I'm not your lawyer, but I can tell you that what was submitted to us includes a property transfer authorization and a revision to an existing power of attorney, extending it to include decisions about long-term care placement." I set the paper cup down on the edge of the cooler. "Long-term care placement." He said it was a formality, I said. My voice came out very even. Teaching voice. 31 years of teaching voice. "I know what he said," Priya said. "I have thought about that moment many times in the months since. About what it cost her to say something. She didn't know me. She had no obligation to me beyond the professional ones, and what she was doing probably stretched past those. She could have just processed the paperwork. People sign things they don't fully understand every day. It's not the notary's job to save them. But she'd looked at me, really looked. I went back into the office. Bryce was on his phone. He put it away quickly when I came in. "Ready?" he said. I sat down across from him. I put my hands flat on the table. Bryce, I said, I want you to explain to me in plain language what I'm signing today. I told you, it's just the in plain language, I said. Not estate management language. Not streamlining language. Tell me what changes today if I sign those papers. He looked at me the way people look at a situation they'd planned to be simpler. Then he started talking about the house, about the account, about how it made sense from a tax perspective to have things consolidated, how Celia and he just wanted to be able to act quickly on my behalf if something happened, how the retirement community in Nepean was waiting for my name and the deposit was time sensitive. I listened to all of it. Then I said, I'm going to need to have my own lawyer review these before I sign. The silence that followed was very loud. Mom, he said. And it was the first time he'd ever called me that, I noted. We've been through this for months. Celia and I have put a lot of time into, I know you have, I said, and I'd like my own lawyer to look at it. I called Theo that night from my kitchen. It was 9:30, which made it 6:30 in Vancouver, and he answered on the second ring, which meant he wasn't at dinner. I told him everything, all of it, starting from November. I'd been keeping it from him because I didn't want to cause trouble, didn't want to seem like I was playing one child against the other, didn't want to admit that I'd perhaps been moving along a current without checking where it was going. Theo was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Mum, the POA you signed in November, was a lawyer present? I said yes, Bryce's lawyer friend. Theo said, that's not how it's supposed to work. He flew in 4 days later. He didn't tell Celia he was coming. He came straight from the airport to my house, still in his travel clothes, and we sat at the kitchen table with the copies of the November documents that I'd thought to keep. I am a retired English teacher. I keep copies of things. And he went through them with me page by page. The power of attorney I'd signed in November hadn't just authorised Celia to act on my behalf in emergencies. With one clause that I'd missed, that Bryce's lawyer friend had presented as standard, it authorised her and Bryce jointly to make decisions about my housing and care if 2 physicians signed a form stating that I was no longer capable of managing my affairs independently. 2 physicians. I thought about the questions Bryce had been asking me over the past year, about my memory, about whether I'd been keeping up with bills, whether I'd had any confusion lately, any moments of forgetfulness. I'd taken them as concern. Theo pulled up the name of the retirement community in Nepean on his laptop. Then he pulled up their parent company. Then he pulled up the investment records of the parent company. Bryce was a minor stakeholder. It took 4 months to sort out. A proper lawyer, mine, not Bryce's friend, a woman named Audrey who specialises in elder law and who I found through the Law Society of Ontario, reviewed everything. The November PO was not invalid exactly, but it was deeply problematic in how it had been presented to me, and what I had understood I was signing versus what I had actually signed were not the same thing. The house never transferred. I never signed the February documents. Celia and I didn't speak for 3 months. That was the hardest part, harder than the legal process, harder than the fear, harder than the anger. She called me in May and she was crying, and she said she'd thought she was doing what was best for me, that Bryce had told her it was all normal, that she hadn't read the documents either. I believed her. I believed her now. That's not nothing. Knowing that your daughter wasn't your enemy, but it also doesn't mean nothing happened. We are careful with each other now. That's the honest word for it. Not distant. Not cold. Careful. Like a bone that healed and you're still conscious of it. Bryce and Celia separated 8 months later. She told me about it without a lot of detail, and I didn't ask for detail. What I know is that she's renting a place in Sentrytown now, and we have Sunday calls, and she came for Easter. The house in Barhoven is still mine. I had the furnace replaced in March. I hired the contractor myself. No referrals from anyone. The backyard is coming in nicely. Gerald planted a serviceberry tree this spring before he got sick, and it is, finally, starting to fill out. I think about Priya sometimes. I wrote a letter to the notary office to her attention a few weeks after everything settled. I thanked her. I said that what she did took a kind of courage that doesn't get talked about enough. The small courage of saying something when saying nothing would have been easier. I don't know if she still works there. I don't know if she read it. I also think about the people who didn't have a prior, who sat at that table without anyone looking up, who signed because they were tired, or because they trusted, or because they'd been so patiently, so carefully prepared over so many months, that signing seemed like the natural end of a long process, not the beginning of losing something. Theo set me up with Audrey's contact information saved in my phone under the label My Lawyer, because he said I should always know exactly where that number is. I have it. I've kept it. I also have, tucked in the front of the red folder where I keep important documents now, a piece of paper with 3 things written on it. I wrote them myself, the night after Theo and I went through everything at the kitchen table. The first thing is, ask who benefits. The second is, slow is not the same as too late. The third is something Gerald used to say whenever I was being pushed into a decision faster than I was comfortable with. He'd put his hand on my arm and say it very quietly. You always have 5 minutes. I've been thinking lately that maybe someone else needs to hear that. That maybe there's someone out there who has been sitting in a slow current for months, being carried somewhere, and hasn't yet thought to put their feet down. So I'm telling you, you have 5 minutes. Use them. I still have the piece of paper with Gerald's words on it. It sits in the red folder, and sometimes I take it out, not because I've forgotten what it says, but because I need to remember how I felt the night I wrote it, sitting at the kitchen table with Theo across from me, both of us quiet, the document spread out between us like something that had washed up on shore. What I keep coming back to is this. Nothing that happened to me was sudden. That's the part people don't expect when I tell this story. There was no single moment of betrayal I could point to and say, there, that's when it started. It was a slow accumulation. A question here, a concern there, a referral, a signature, a missed statement, a laugh I made about my own living room. Each thing small enough to dismiss, all of it adding up to a direction I hadn't chosen. I've thought a lot about what Priya did that morning. She was a young woman doing an administrative job, and she looked at a set of documents and at the woman sitting across the desk, and she made a quiet decision to say something. She didn't lecture me. She didn't call the police. She just handed me a paper cup of water and asked, in the most reasonable voice, whether this was something I wanted to do today. That question gave me back my footing. It cost her something, professional risk, the discomfort of speaking up, and she did it anyway. That is what I would call genuine decency. Not the kind that makes noise, the kind that acts when it would be easier not to. And then there's what I had to do after. I had to call my son and admit I'd been signing things I didn't fully understand. I had to sit with a lawyer and go through every page of documents I'd trusted someone else to explain to me. I had to look at myself honestly and ask how I had gotten here. Not to punish myself for it, but to actually understand it. That kind of honesty takes something out of you. It is not comfortable. But I think it is what separates people who learn from hard things and people who simply survive them. The hardest part was Celia. It would have been so much simpler to be purely angry. Anger is clean. What I had instead was something more complicated. A daughter I love, who had let herself be led by a man she trusted, who had not asked enough questions either. We were both, in our own ways, too willing to let someone else manage the details. I think that's worth sitting with, not as blame, as a pattern worth breaking. I don't know who else is out there in the middle of a slow current, being carried somewhere they haven't agreed to go. Maybe it's a family situation. Maybe it's something else entirely, a financial arrangement, a relationship, a job, a version of their life that someone else has been quietly designing for them. The shape of it doesn't matter much. What matters is whether they've stopped recently to ask, whose plan is this actually? You're allowed to stop. You're allowed to ask for water and take 5 minutes in a washroom and look at yourself in the mirror and think clearly. You don't owe anyone your signature before you're ready. Theo still calls every Sunday. Celia comes for Easter. The serviceberry tree is filling out beautifully, and I know exactly where my lawyer's number is.